welcome to
Bean Stuff.
Today we are going to be talking about different types of coffee, or espresso, I should say more specifically, and different ways that you can enjoy it.
That's right. Espresso is the base to many enjoyable drinks. And when I say many, it just goes on. I've got a book in front of me here, and half of them are just different espresso recipes. It's amazing.
Well, I'm staring over at those the one book you have there, and it is got an affogato, which I don't know if we're talking about that, but it's making me a little hungry over here.
It's funny you should say that, because I was looking through I was going to go through the basics today, but one of my favorites actually is the affogato.
Really?
But it's just so easy to do if you have an espresso machine. But you put a blob of ice cream. Usually vanilla works really well.
Or vanilla bean is sometimes good too.
That's right. And then not even half an ounce of coffee, of espresso, you don't need the whole thing or the 2 ounces, is perfect. And man, is it good.
Well, and if you don't know what an affogato is, I know we weren't going to talk about this one, but we mentioned it. So if you're watching the video on YouTube, I'll put a little picture right above my hand right here. If you're listening on the podcast, it is a little, like, one single small scoop of coffee with a shot of espresso poured over the top.
I think I've said that already.
Did you?
Yeah.
Well, now we might. Well, let's get into it. I think we should start right at the root. Right at the
good idea.
Right at the
base.
The base of the tree.
Yeah.
Go up from there. So that means starting with espresso.
Espresso, not espresso as we've said before, but espresso.
ES.
It's right, not fast and quick, but more it's pressed, it's forced. And really, you could look up many definitions of espresso, but small, strong drink using finely ground coffee under high pressure water.
Well, and what does it mean in Italian? It means like to push through forcefully.
That's right. Correct. Yeah, I believe so.
Which is the definition of espresso, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. It is a packed amount of coffee with a boiler that's built up enough pressure to push that hot water through the coffee. And
And one part that's probably not overlooked, but is the crema. That's the top part. We could have a whole podcast on crema. I've done an article on crema.
Well, and it's not just the top section, but it's that top little brown piece that typically looks a little bit almost caramelized, or that has a lot of its own properties and flavor.
That's right. It's usually the first thing you put goes into your mouth, because there's like 3 layers on an espresso. That top one, the crema, is got a little taste of all of its own. It's got little even bits of grind of coffee in it itself. It's amazing stuff.
Does it really?
It does.
Wow. And it's a different texture almost. It's a thick, it has a lot more, not maybe body, but a lot more, there's a viscosity to it and a fluffiness.
Which goes to say it's a good signal if your coffee is fresh or not. So if you're getting shots pulled and you've got no crema on it, usually it could be a sign your coffee is stale or not fresh.
Right. Well, and I think, espresso, we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into specifically timing of espresso and specifics of those in another later or different episode. Okay. But because we could go into we could do that for quite a.
We're already talking about quite a bit.
But so you start with espresso. That's kind of the original. I think it's the original. It seems to be the most common.
Very much. It's the base for, as I say, for all other drinks. And then you got your weight ratio, how it goes. And there's different definitions. There's a bit of, not controversy, but there's different definitions out there. Typically, it would be like 1 to 2, of ground coffee and 2 to finished beverage, like 1 ounce to 2 ounces. It depends. Sometimes like 2 to 2.
Well, and I think something to clarify is that if you go to a coffee shop and you say, "Hey, could I have an espresso?" you were going to get like a little tiny shot of coffee with no milk. It's not.
That's right.
An espresso is not what we think of as
Hopefully
more
that's
like a
what
latte.
you'll get.
Yeah, if you get something with milk in it, you're
that's right.
working with something.
Yeah.
So espresso is the very beginning.
Espresso. Doppio is for 2 ounces as such, so it's a double shot. But that has
an espresso is 1 ounce, and a doppio is 2 ounces.
And I'm not going to say always, because traditionally, perhaps because I think more modern times, 2 has become the traditional amount you will put in a drink of espresso, 2 ounces.
Gotcha. Well, and
60 mils.
One thing I realized before we move on too far is we're not drinking espresso.
No, we're not.
We're drinking nothing we're talking about today.
No, we're drinking coffee.
What kind of coffee is this one?
Oh, this is one we call Base Camp, but I did it because I did it through a cone, Kone. And just to see, we were talking about it last week, whenever. And
a couple weeks ago, yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and we did a Chemex with a cone. But it is tasty.
I do have to admit something, though.
What's that?
I got a little distracted, and it went to 5.5 rather than 4 minutes.
I could taste that.
Yeah, I knew you could. I could see it in your face.
Yeah. No, but I wanted to address it in case someone heard slurping in the background. So we've got espresso. We've got doppio. Is that what you said? Doppio?
That's for two in Italian, I believe. Not that I know Italian. I hardly know English.
So as we move on from espresso, and are these in any particular order as far as like?
You'll see a bit of an order. I'm going through more of the traditional espresso drinks that are out there that are common that people will typically know and will ask for.
Gotcha.
There's other ones out there. I mean, I'm not going through the Irish whiskies. I'm not going through. There's
well,
just
and
so
there
many.
is a long subset of just like, if you have an espresso and a latte, there's about 1,000 in between, or each different increments of different measurements.
And even with those, the latte you've mentioned, the Caffe Latte or the Cappuccino, there's differences in definitions of how much milk, how much foam.
Right.
There's a lot. So therefore, I admit at the beginning, I'm not an authority on this. I just know what I've been brought up with and what's happening in our area, neck of the woods, and I'll do my best.
Well, that's the other thing is there are drinks that are out there, but that you don't necessarily see in different parts of the world. And we might touch on some of those here.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing. If you don't know what you're listening to, like you hear us say something, it's like, well, maybe it would be interesting to ask the next time you go for a coffee, ask for one of the things that you haven't heard of before and see if they say, well, what is that? Or if you just get it. And if you get it, is it correct?
Yeah. Who knows?
But so moving on from the espresso, we go on to our number 2 for today, which is the Ristretto.
Right, Ristretto, which I believe means restricted. And basically you're getting a smaller, stronger espresso. You're restricting actually the water, how much water is going to be in the end product.
Interesting. Now, I want to clarify something because there's a lot of misconceptions of the word stronger in coffee. A lot of times people think stronger means more caffeine. Stronger means, all these different things. If it's a burnt coffee, it's stronger, right? No.
Exactly.
So when you say a smaller, stronger espresso, what do you mean by stronger?
I'm going to use another word that hopefully won't be misinterpreted, but more intense. So what's extracted...
As far as a flavor, it's an intensity of flavor.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not necessarily more or less caffeine, although in this case it may be a little, but you wouldn't know less caffeine because it's smaller.
Well, and why... this might be a little bit I might be going off topic a little bit here. But when it's stronger, why is it stronger when there's less water? Is it more of there's a higher concentration, like there's less liquid that's diluting or that's gone through? And I guess is it like there's just less water to dilute the actual coffee? Or?
The dilution is different. That's probably the major reason. It's really extracting solubles in the coffee at a different rate, and it could turn to bitterness. You don't want that. But some like that a little more. And so the flavor notes are going to change because you haven't extracted or under-extract, I should say, what you typically use.
Right.
Which is a good question because if you under-extract, you're going to get a bitterness and a stringency, and therefore you probably want the grind for a Ristretto, you want it to be finer. So its water goes through, it's not going to go through so fast, and therefore you're not going to get so much the bitterness. It could still happen though.
But with a finer grind, kind of like we talked about in our episode on grinding, the finer the grind, the more surface area is exposed of the bean. So even with that smaller amount of water, there's actually going to be a similar amount of extraction, or you're going to allow more extraction because you are exposing more of the bean.
It's true, and because of that longer extraction, you're going to get a certain taste. And there's experimentation here. I mean, top of my head, I'd say, okay, you're typically going to have if you 2 ounces is going to be your 60 mils is going to be your espresso, then you want less. So if it's 2 ounces, try 1.5. And that's restricting. It may not be traditionally what it is, but you're restricting the flow and taste and say, well, I like this better, or yuck.
Well, and I'm just thinking like the amount of minutia. I think I've said that word on the podcast before, but you can really drill down so deep because different types of coffee are going to have different flavors, obviously. And then the different grinds that you use are going to also affect the flavor of the shot. Or if you're doing a ristretto, they're going to affect that. And the amount of time you do is going to affect that. So there's so many aspects that, a second more, a second less, a grind a little bit finer, a little bit coarser, they're going to have such an effect on the actual coffee, and that goes for all of these.
That's right. You could even get espresso machines that have the portafilter little levers that can control the time of the water comes through. Now, these are expensive machines, obviously.
Yeah.
But you don't need those. You can just do it by eye and your little timer.
Well, and as a segue to our next one, after we spent such a long time on the Ristretto, this one is called is this called the Lungo?
That's very good. It's very good. You need to do more Italian. Lungo. That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Sorry. That
was intense.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry about that.
That's an Italian word, I believe, again for long. So this is the opposite of Ristretto.
Gotcha.
So these two go hand in hand. You sometimes want the shorter Ristretto, or you may want the longer Lungo, which is 2 to 3 times as much water that you would typically put in.
Interesting. So you have kind of a range of Ristretto, Espresso, and Lungo.
Yeah, that'd be correct. Yep, just how it goes. Yep.
Or short, medium.
And
long.
the normal was going to be obviously an espresso right in the middle there.
And I'm looking in some of the notes we have here, and it looks like 2 to 3 times the water.
Yeah. So if you've got 2 ounces of espresso,
I mean, you're approaching a drinkful size, just within the espresso shot.
And you may not want to do as much as that because you are approaching an Americano or long black. You're starting to get into a different realm of stuff.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, what you're trying to do is trying to balance acidity as you add the water. So again, you may want to do opposite of the Ristretto. You may want to grind coarser so it comes through a little faster because you're going to have a lot more.
Wow. So it's going to be a coarser grind because we are going to be extending the length of the shot.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
And again, that's all up to kind of experimentation.
Yeah.
And I like what you said about the balancing acidity and water. So the more water we add, the more we counteract acidity. Is that kind of
That's kind of correct. The other things happen. It gets weaker. You could get, bitterness and things coming up again but less likely than the Ristretto.
But there's that, you're always searching for that median, that middle ground that works the best between both the amount of coffee, the amount of acidity and the amount of water in that shot.
It's a personal preference at this point. So
yeah, you're getting into some of the finer weeds there.
Yeah, I know. I do a bit.
And no, I think it's great. And so I guess the first one we have here that has something other than just water and coffee, is going to be the macchiato. And I actually have a question on this one already.
Okay. Yes.
But I'll save that for a little bit more into the macchiato.
Oh, okay. And macchiato, you're not getting too far away from just espresso and water, or coffee and water.
Fair.
Macchiato, a mark means, I guess it means to mark in Italian.
That
seems to make sense.
Makes a lot
of
sense.
Staining is another sort of version of or interpretation of it.
Right.
And I mean, typically, I do remember. Yeah, I do. Oh, no. Yeah, I do. I do remember when I was in Italy because I was thinking, I'm thinking Brazil.
We talked about on another episode the espresso machine you got in Italy.
Well, I actually got it in England, but I was exposed to it in Italy.
There we go.
Right.
But anyway,
I remember seeing them. A barista would. I didn't even know they were called baristas in those days. But the person serving the coffee.
Yes.
They would put up like 7 shots of espresso.
Yeah.
And if one wanted a little bit of milk, well, that's fine. They put a little bit of milk in, but the milk goes down underneath, and then you don't know which one has the milk and which one does have the milk. So they would. This is what I believe I was told. But, they marked as a little blob of foam. This one has the milk.
Interesting, because that crema can look very much like.
Yes.
I think of we look at espressos on like Instagram or whatever, and you see all those cool little designs and stuff. But what's around the white part of the design, or the milk foam part, is the crema mixed in with milk.
Yep, it gets
but
all
it has
incorporated.
a similar color. So in a small amount of coffee, it might be hard to differentiate the two.
Yep, it sort of mixes in with the brownness of the coffee.
Well, I think this is a perfect point to insert my question.
I'm a bit nervous. Excuse me.
I one night.
Yes.
Was in the deep, dark realms of Twitter.
Whoa.
And I know. I came back, though. But I found a question on there that got me curious. Mm-hmm. And the question was, why don't people stir macchiatos? Because if there's a mark of milk and it doesn't fully, it's just you're marking it down the side or something like that, why don't we stir them to get all of the milk infused with the rest of the coffee? So I was curious on your opinion of that. I had an idea.
Yeah, and you probably got a good idea, I'm sure. It's sort of what I was just saying, that the mark is so they could identify the coffee, the shot. There's pluses and minuses of what you're talking about here. If you stir it, as I said, often espresso will go into possibly 3 layers.
Yeah.
And if you stir it, the advantage of that, you're going to put all the milk, or everything together, not the milk, but all the coffee is going to get together, and you'll get a consistent, balanced espresso if it started off that way.
Right.
By not doing that, this is what I like doing myself, is you have a taste, and the first thing is what you were talking about before you taste.
Right.
Is the crema.
Well, that was kind of my thought, was like the two aspects where if you mix it, you have a consistent taste. Mm-hmm. And it probably isn't bad, but if you don't mix it, you then do not. So not mixing it doesn't make sure it also keeps intact the different layers of the coffee. So you have coffee or the crema, and then you may have coffee because the milk's heavier, so it may sit.
There's not usually milk in it, obviously. I'm saying just straight espresso.
Oh, straight espresso. I was thinking the macchiato.
Well, macchiato, yeah, too.
And so if you don't stir your macchiato, you get those layers of different flavor. Whereas if you stir it, you don't. And the same thing with espresso. You just don't have the milk aspect to that.
Exactly. And those different flavors, as you drink the first one, you think about it. This is what I also remember in Italy. They drink the first part, because espresso is small.
Right.
They were probably getting 1 ounce.
Drink the first part, you mean just a sip?
They sip and they think, I don't know what they think about, but that's wonderful. And then they just go, whoop, down it goes, and they're gone.
Well, and because it's going to get cold pretty quick, too.
That's true. It's just a small little amount, but that's all they need to do.
Well, and that's another aspect of some of these drinks, especially these 4 that we've talked about so far, is they are such a small quantity that it's very possible that it's going to cool quickly, which is going to then add another aspect of flavor to it. It's going to make the flavor change because it's cooling. I think, we talked about it in How to Taste Coffee, the episode we did about how if coffee is really hot, it can trick you into making it taste. You don't taste the bad stuff as much.
As it cools, you're going to get, possibly if there's a defect there, you'll taste it.
And so that might even be, you take a sip and then I pass it to you and you're like, oh, this is terrible. And I'm like, what? So the thing is,
my definition, by the way, is the marking is the Italian barista. That's what they would do. More recently, it's been topped with a little more milk than just your typical mark, just to identify it.
Yeah,
and it's topped with foam, and the barista likes that a little bit because they can even put a little bit of design. Hard to do in a small little cup,
some of the cups they come in are just tiny.
I would call them dinky, but that's what they are. 2 ounces. Probably the cup's 3 ounces overall, so you can get a lungo if you need to. But that's more recently. It's been topped with a little more milk than a typical macchiato would. Because then you've got another player come along, Starbucks, and this gets very confusing. They've added, I think it's called the caramel macchiato.
Which is interesting in itself because a macchiato is a mark of milk. So if you add caramel in there, what are you doing to the construct of that drink itself?
Well, you're changing the flavor quite a bit by putting caramel in to start with, but it just confuses when you ask for a macchiato. Well, what are you asking for? I would typically ask for a cafe latte,
right,
or a cafe macchiato, just so you get the right thing.
Well, and that's I guess a key aspect of all these drinks we're talking about is to pay attention, because there are so many subsets of definitions and different people, different baristas, all that kind of stuff can have a different idea of what their macchiato is.
We're going to have a lot of annoyed baristas out there going, what are you talking about? Have you been listening to Bean stuff?
And I guess that's to say that, there are some concrete definitions of these things, but people can still mess with them.
Number five,
we're getting into some more. I mean, macchiato is pretty typical now. Yes. Maybe not at like a McDonald's. Well, they probably have it there too. But I haven't been.
Let's not go there. Let's not go there.
But we're kind of coming into a more commonplace coffee that we see you can almost get it anywhere. I would say it'd be hard pressed to not find it at a coffee shop.
You'd see it on most menus. That is the cappuccino.
Cappuccino. Yeah. And I would say, I don't know, I feel like this is probably my first, like this is where I started.
Yeah, and that's what I knew when I started, that cappuccino. That's what I would have gotten in Italy and Greece and places in Europe, because it was just well known, traditional.
And I would say that we're starting to get into a territory of coffee drinks that are probably better suited if you are not a coffee drinker yet, or if you don't like coffee that much. This is going to be a bit, maybe a better intro, because there's a little bit more milk. It's a little bit more mild in its flavor as far as like the intensity of it.
That's interesting you say that. I agree with you. And what typically happens, I found over my 15, 20 years of just in the coffee industry, has been that you start, like you're saying, with a Caffe Latte, we're going to get to in a moment, a cappuccino, and you actually start really enjoying the coffee flavor so much you want less of the milk.
Right.
And so you start going down from to a Cortado. We're going to finish on that one today, which was one of my favorites. But it's just less and less milk until you get to saying in the afternoon, I just want an espresso straight. Thank you.
Whereas I think if you start with that, it's going to make your lips pucker. Mm-hmm. It's going to make you just all sorts of, kind of like biting into a lemon, completely different flavor, but at the same time, there's an intensity to that. Which, and again, if you want to, go for it. Obviously.
And I would say it is intense. It doesn't, if it is puckering you and making you all go sour like that, it's a shot that hasn't been pulled very well.
That's fair. I would just say it's a shock compared to a cappuccino.
Yep, you're right.
It's a drastically different intensity.
I was reading today as we were preparing for this that the cappuccino in Italy, where it sort of originated, was that they would always have a cappuccino to start with, which has milk in it. We will talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
And because this may not be true, but it said in Europe, particularly Southern Europe, lactose intolerant more so, and therefore they would have their one milk drink, which they loved and was delicious and sweet. Then the rest of the day they'd have an espresso without milk.
So they would make one of the drinks that they
the first one
would be a cappuccino. Mm-hmm. So they would be willing to suffer for the cappuccino, and then they would have espresso the rest of the day. Interesting.
Anyway, that's interesting.
Wow. So cappuccino.
Yeah. I got to say first up with cappuccino, that there's.
I feel like this is probably the most broadly used name in coffee.
It is, and because of that reason, it's also broadly abused too in terms of what is a cappuccino, and particularly where did the cappuccino come from. And I've heard many things that could be true, but may not be true.
Lots of myths.
There is a couple of them that, as I've been reading this, I've realized I'm not so sure this is true. I think this might fall in that category of myth.
Did you find this on the lore of the internet?
I did.
This is coffee lore.
And talking to a few coffee friends as well. I always used to think it was the hood of the monks, and I was even told at one stage it was the bald spot.
The hood? What do you mean the hood of the monks?
Oh, it's sort of this. It's a cap that goes over their head, and the cappuccino came from the monks and their hood.
Would they drink the cappuccinos or something? Or
they probably did, being if they were in Italy. But it was just
it was somehow related to that.
That's
possibly
their origin of that, and their bald spot was like the milk, the fluffy milk in the front. And I sort of think I believe that, but
I don't know if I've ever heard that.
Oh well, that's what I'd heard. I mean,
I mean,
it started in Vienna, 19th century, I think, and it was called. It's got a name here, Cappuccino. I didn't say that quite right, but and they would have coffee with milk until the whole drink shaded sort of brown of the monks' robes. So there's a monk part in there, but not necessarily their hood and their cappuccino.
Right.
Not necessary.
Man, it's very interesting. It goes kind of like the episode we did on the history of coffee. There's so many interesting little things that may or may not exist.
We may never know.
So, rule of thirds with cappuccinos.
Oh, that was the other myth I think I came across. And I've read it, I've seen it many times.
Right.
Which basically the rule of thirds mean that there's a third espresso, a third of milk, and a third of foam. And in the cup you'll see
equal parts of those three.
Exactly. And as you start looking at that, you read about that and you realize actually probably the first time you come across that rule of thirds is 1950.
That's not that long ago.
It's not. It's and I think, oh, just a moment, red warning light there. Perhaps that's not how a cappuccino was originally made.
Well, especially considering that the original name was from the 19th century.
There you go. Good detective work there. But as you look at the more longevity, how it's been for a lot longer,
right?
It's typically been either 111. That's what the or thirds, I should say.
Right.
But more typically, it's been a 122.
And the one being what?
1 ounce of, for instance, 1 ounce of espresso, 2 ounces of milk, 2 ounces of foam.
Gotcha.
That seems to have the oldest tradition in Europe.
And I would say that the cappuccino has a lot more foam than I think most people may expect. Like there's actually there's more foam than there is espresso.
That's right.
In if you're doing a 1-2-2.
And that's where it's changed, I think, for the good. That foam can be when I was growing up, it was very airy and bubbly and
almost like Swiss cheese.
Yeah. And you take a sip and you really got a taste of coffee. All you got was this airy, fairy milk.
Right.
And it was rather off. It wasn't a very nice taste.
Well, and I think that that's something interesting too, is that the milk throughout a lot of these coffees, it needs to be a velvety,
good word,
very, it's almost like a cream.
It's right. It's like a denseness to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have something, you look down at your drink and it's just got like a bunch of holes, kind of like big bubbles. It's like
careful warning again.
Yeah.
Which would be another podcast 494 will be how to foam your milk, because that's gonna.
I'm curious how we would show that on a podcast.
Yeah, and the noise cutting. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Anyway. So yeah, you're looking. That's another thing to look for with the cappuccino. Since there is so much foam, it becomes a much larger factor of that drink.
Yes,
than
and it's
maybe
important
a macchiato.
that milk is done well, so that you taste the sweetness of the milk combined with the sweetness of the espresso itself, and you got a great cappuccino.
Well, and it's incredible. You start adding in. So not only do you have all the coffee variables that add to the taste or subtract from the taste, but then you start adding milk. There's different types of milk. All that kind of stuff. It's like, there's a whole new subset of variables.
I just realizing in New Zealand, and I think it was done worldwide perhaps not outside Italy, where next to the cappuccino, the machine, the barista would make it, you'd have a big glass jar of either cinnamon or chocolate. And the last thing they would do is, what would you like on this? And you could shake cinnamon or shake chocolate on it.
Like a little dusting on top.
Yep. And I just realized, probably because they knew the milk was going to taste so bad, it was so aerated, that you needed a little sweetness of chocolate or cinnamon to cut through before you got to the actual coffee underneath all that.
Well, it's interesting because I had a cappuccino yesterday with cinnamon sprinkled on top.
Yes.
Made by you.
I know. I was thinking of this episode.
And it's so interesting. I mean, now I'm getting off in the weeds again, but it's another aspect where there wasn't a lot of cinnamon on there, but I could smell it and it adds to the taste. So there's so many little flavor things that can affect it.
Wow, we've got four more. Yeah.
Let's dig in.
And let's just go a little faster here, because they're all similar. They all have the base of espresso. And one is it's called the Caffe Latte, which interestingly is not originated in Italy.
Wow. And yet it's Italian with latte.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Or the name is not the coffee, or not the drink, sorry.
it was, espresso went worldwide basically, but some people thought it was very bitter and intense. So therefore, what should we do? We add some milk to this to sweeten it down.
Right.
More milk than the cappuccino, for instance, and less foam perhaps as well.
Yeah.
And it had this large amount of milk, therefore, and became known as the Caffe Latte, latte meaning milk, of course.
And is there a typical ratio of the Caffe Latte?
It's varied again, but 1-2-2 would be quite typical of the latte, or 1-2-1. There's not so much foam. There's just more milk in it, so it all depends.
The milk takes a different form in the cup.
That's right. In New Zealand, early days, it would come out like a soup bowl. It was so large.
I've seen you make it in a soup bowl.
I know.
A long
I
time
remember
ago.
I had to put another double shot in before I even start tasting coffee. It had so much milk. There used to be a joke in New Zealand. You'd lift up the cup underneath, and you look under, and the cup would say Anchor, which is the milk company in New Zealand. They were so happy that it was
because there was so much milk in you got to fill it with something.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a great segue to the flat white.
Oh,
Which, you know what? I think for the first time I saw this in a Starbucks was probably like 5 or 6 years ago.
It's pretty recent in Starbucks, yeah.
And I was in Seattle at a random, not even like a Starbucks that was like a cool special one, but just a regular Starbucks. And I looked up at the board and it said flat white. And I thought, no way.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a flat white. And I would say, I said cappuccino earlier was probably my first coffee, but you know what? In reality, it was probably the flat white.
Probably was. Probably was.
Or some combination. And this is the one that you and I this would be this is our standard. This is what we're standardized on for most days.
Of course, it was invented in New Zealand, obviously. Joke. New Zealand and Australia both pretty.
There's a tussle
strong with who made
it.
I'm going to say it's an Australasian drink. How's that for
really?
diplomacy?
You're not going to take a side there.
No, well, sort of. And but basically, I believe it came from those cafe lattes with so much milk and stuff going on. You just sort of flatten that out somehow, make it flat. And I want it white. I still want milk in there, but just flatten it out.
Yeah.
And obviously the word flat white, that may not be totally historic and factual as that, but that's what it's done. It's flattened it out. So now you've got this. You can even baristas love it because now you can do the thing called latte art, and you can do designs.
Well, you don't have that thick layer of foam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're going to make that foam and see it, and you can do wonderful designs.
And I know for us, typically, we have about a 5-ounce cup. So it's like 2 ounces of espresso.
Yes.
And then 3 ounces of milk. And I think, I know we have a 5 ounce, and then we also have, a 5 or a 6 ounce is kind of the two we've switched between.
That's right. And it's interesting. The utensil you put all these drinks in, the size of them makes a huge difference. So when I use a cappuccino cup, which is actually a little larger, you'll always think that I haven't given you enough. What I'm trying to do is a flat
You've
white.
skimped on the drink.
Yep, I've made a flat white the right ratio and not just filled it up with milk. Oh, and that I used to hate that when you're in an airport somewhere saying I said you have a flat white and have, if you were able to even explain what that was because you wanted more coffee flavor, they would fill up the 2 ounces of espresso, then 3 ounces of milk, and there'll be another 4 ounces they could put in. And they say, oh, I feel so bad, I'm going to skimping you, and they start putting the milk in, and you go, stop. Anyway.
Right. Well, and I think that's a challenge I submit to someone in the world listening, but and it depends where you are. Some places are really good, but it is sometimes difficult to get the right type of coffee into the right size of cup, or if it's not in the right size of cup, the right amount in that size of cup. Because I have definitely leaned over the counter and looked and said, "Can I have it in that?" And it's like the little tiny like tester cups, or it's like the smallest they have might be 12 ounces, and if you're wanting 5 ounces of coffee, it's really hard to convince people that you truly want that.
I know they think they're diddling out of money because no,
I want that.
Two more.
Number 8, the Americano.
Oh, yes, the Americano.
Was this invented in the U.S.?
Not so much as, again, in Italy, but in World War II, I believe. Yeah. And the Americans the espresso was a bit new for them, found it a bit too intense, as we were talking before. Oh, my. And they'd often over the counter and say, could you just water that down somewhat? Right. And so they'd put their ounce of espresso in there and then fill the rest up with hot water.
Interesting.
And stir that up. And that was known as the Americano, Cafe Americano. There's another one called a long black, I believe, which is, I don't know if it's New Zealand, Australasian, let me say.
Yeah.
Where once again, it's important, I think, of what goes in first, the espresso or the hot water. If you're going to make an Americano, I like the long black that does it the opposite way around, and it puts the hot water in first, then it puts the espresso on top.
Right.
So the first taste again is espresso rather than hot water from it being done the opposite way around, I should say.
Well, and it's interesting. Even with just two simple ingredients, the process, the order, the amount, the ratio, all of it can change it so drastically. Do you enjoy Americanos?
I do have them sometimes. I do, yep. And I found, I heard a tip once, and I thought that sounds a bit silly, where they would, and I asked if they could do the long black style, and put the espresso in last. And then I was told once, just get a spoon, and if you've got time, you can do this. You can scrape off the crema on top, and it actually makes it a better tasting, sweeter drink, because the crema has little particles of coffee in it actually as well.
Interesting, yeah.
And it just made it a little bitter. So there's a little trick there. You may just start scooping off the top. Yeah, up to you. Some like to even do it for espresso, but I like to have the crema on espresso.
I think it does add a good amount of flavor to it.
Yeah.
And this one, the
Cortado.
Cortado.
Number 9, not because it's last, but because I've been enjoying this recently.
Well, it's very close to a flat white.
It is actually. I realize that in my head.
I mean, sometimes I would almost want to consider some of the coffees that we consider flat whites.
There's another
Cortado.
And there's another close cousin of this would be called the Piccolo, which I believe is Australian, and that's got even less milk, I believe, than the Cortado.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it's again, as I said at the beginning, as you start drinking coffee and enjoying good coffee, you start wanting just that taste rather than, and so you get smaller amounts of milk. And Cortado is a good balance for doing that.
Right.
It's one of those coffees that actually, it's not Italian on origins like a lot of the others.
Right.
It's actually Spanish, I believe, in Madrid was where it was first sort of really drunken a lot of.
Yeah.
And the espresso is brewed longer, and it's a little weaker than what the Italians made.
And when you say weaker, what do you mean by weak? Like, as far as intensity?
It's got a little more milk. It's sort of like I guess you say a 1-1 or a 3-3. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
Or 2-2. That's how I like it. 2 ounces of espresso, 2 ounces of milk.
Interesting. Half and half.
Half and half. Not half and
No,
half.
no.
Careful.
Yeah, we'll be careful with our words there.
Yeah. So, and it foamed that milk really well, and you've got a nice, just sort of in between. They would typically serve it in a glass. It doesn't worry me, but it's sometimes it gets a bit hot in that glass.
Yeah, a little hard to handle.
Yeah.
Well, that's our 9 for today.
I
mean, there are so many out there. We've only just handpicked 9 of those, and you've got a whole book over there.
The Buna, and I had quite a few of those in Ethiopia, and the Scandinavian coffee, and the Romano, and the Red Eye that a lot of students would love. Anyway.
And there's an awesome chart somewhere on the internet that I'll put a link to.
Oh yeah, there's a few of them out there actually.
And if you're watching it online, I'll put it right above my hand here.
Wow.
It'll be right here. But there's a really cool chart that kind of goes from.
Can you put it in my hand?
Sure, we can put it in your hand.
Thank you.
But so there's a cool chart that goes basically from like straight espresso all the way to like the milkiest drink, and it kind of walks through all the different styles, shows you a really cool picture. And so I'll put a link to that.
Good.
I'll also put a link to that book that you got over there, Dad, because that's a pretty cool little book. It's called Coffee Obsession.
Yeah.
But it's really cool. It walks through in a really thorough manner all the different drinks. Again, thank you so much for listening. If you are currently listening and you're at 37 minutes or whatever we are at currently, I would just want to thank you because you are committed.
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody gets here.
No, not
sure. So to whoever is here, thank you so much for listening. As always, feel free to like, to comment, to send us questions, anything like that. Always give us a rating. Tell us if we're doing good or if you're like, yeah, stop.
Sorry.
But we enjoy doing it, and we enjoy we want you to enjoy it as well. So thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to the next one. Well, thank you so much. Have a good day.